an ultimate global podcast. Hello, and welcome to our special weekly podcast on trending international and social affairs. You're listening to Saurabh Kora and George Mavros from Sydney.
Good evening to one and all for another very special episode of Ultimate Global Podcast. And today we are talking about a very special topic. And we know that mental health is something which we keep on talking about each and every day, especially during the pandemic when everyone was always taking care of their emotional health as well as physical health. To discuss about this, we have got two speakers today, one from Australia, another one from the UK, and both are running a very special podcast called Never Alone. So I'm sure that we're going to gain a lot of insights, not only on this topic, but also to understand what are the interesting things they discuss on their podcast. To start off with, would you like to tell a bit about Never Alone, Joe, and then probably Mark can add some points to that?
Yeah, so hashtag Never Alone. It's a mental health podcast that started in 2019 as a video podcast hosted by Jordan Harbison and directed by myself. So the whole point of the podcast was to give people a platform to kind of speak up about their mental health, and we also had like the professional side, so both sides of the story. So you're getting advice, and also you're given like the lived experience side. I have my own like experience of mental health, and I felt like there wasn't that many resources out there for people to share their story and speak up and encourage others to speak up. And then due to the pandemic, we moved online, and eventually moved to audio to try and get some more listeners in. And Mark, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I mean, just for me, I've known Joe for years, and honestly, I've been trying to encourage him to get me on the show for quite a long time. And when the pandemic hit and we all went online, it was a great opportunity for Joe and I to hook up and do the show. So I mean, Joe is the creative genius around this, but yeah, I mean, I think we're producing a really great show.
That's fabulous to know about some of those points on your show and the episodes that you have been doing. I also went through your profile, and while I was checking that, quite interesting to show that this is not the only thing that you're doing, but also, doing several other projects along with that. So that sounds pretty interesting to me. How important do you feel, Mark, coming back to you, is the mental health in today's society, especially amongst, the different age groups? Millennials might have a different sort of problem. The baby boomers might have a different sort of mental health problems. How important do you think this has become, especially after the COVID-19 pandemic?
Yeah, I mean, I think incredibly important. I mean, I'm going to maybe make some general statements here. I mean, in terms of, I think millennials, I mean, generally, I think there's a lot more understanding and a lot more acceptance of mental health and, looking for support around mental health than perhaps there was with my generation. I think a lot of I work with a lot of young people, and they're very, very open to, therapeutic space and talking about mental health, which is great. But that being said, I think there's a lot more pressure perhaps on younger people than there was when I was growing up. Really, I mean, there's, it's a really wide conversation, but the pressures of society, generally, I think increase social media, which can be a blessing and a curse, internet dating. I mean, there's lots and lots of different areas, I think, where younger people, just a feeling increasing pressure. Work is another one.
Yeah. And what do you think, Joe, in terms of the problems that Mark has listed? What are some of the ways that you generally suggest to people to come out of that? Because sometimes people just say that just go out for a walk or just listen to your favorite song or just read a book to just divert your attention from what you are doing. Are there any such ways that you also suggest to people through your podcast?
Well, we obviously, as I mentioned before, we encourage people to talk to others, and even if it's just a family member or friend, and check in on your friends if you feel like there's something off about them, like if they're not as chatty as normal, talk to them. For me personally, I like to go and do photography. And Mark talks a lot about mindfulness, like going out into the wilderness and kind of just taking in the natural air and the fresh air, or sitting and doing yoga or listening to music, like just take care of yourself.
So, are there any specific ways that you have been suggesting, Mark, back in the UK?
In terms of coping strategies?
Absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, coping strategies, I think, are so important. I mean, I'm a really, really big fan of mindfulness. Mindfulness, I think, can be a really, really fantastic coping strategy for, a host of mental health conditions, anxiety, depression, many, many health conditions. So I'm a real advocate of mindfulness, whether that is in terms of meditation or everyday mindfulness, plenty of ways that people can, really kind of become a more mindful. And I also think, just I guess the things that seem obvious, but things that people don't always do, if you're feeling bad, talk to someone. When people are depressed, they often withdraw and don't talk to anyone, and I think when people are depressed, the depression is telling them to do the very opposite of what they need to do in order to feel better. So, really making use of your peer network, having conversations, and as our podcast says, you're never alone, but you have to reach out to people, professionals. There are people, the Samaritans, there are people that will listen to you. And talking, I think, and being around people can be really helpful. And then people will tend to share their experiences too, right? I mean, I think this is quite common around mental health. When one person opens up, then someone will say, "Oh, actually, I've been feeling a lot of anxiety around social media or something." So, I think it's really, really important, I think, to open up and talk about mental health. I think that's a good place to start, really.
Yeah, absolutely. Talking to another person. Yeah, go forward, Joe.
Do you mind if I just add something to that? One thing we've been doing, we're on our second season. One thing we've been doing in this series is every time we have a guest on, at the end of the episode, we get them to give their favorite piece of advice for mental health. So obviously, then our listeners have all these different pieces of advice that they can use or choose to use from professional people or people that have gone through their own personal experience as well. Because a lot of our professional guests have had their own personal experience with mental health, and that's why they've gone into the field that they've gone into.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what, the thing that Mark was pointing out, that talking to another person can be a very simple strategy of expressing your emotions, or just showcasing yourself to someone else, opening up to someone else on whatever is going on within you. It can be something related to the problems that you have been facing in the recent times. But when you share it with someone, you're just sharing your emotions, sharing your feelings with someone, and that reduces the overall mental stress that you have. Another thing that I really wanted to discuss in this episode is related to social media. A lot of people, especially a lot of millennials, people who are coming from my age bracket, they say that whenever they go through any negative news or any sort of negativity, social media is definitely a place where you are able to communicate well with others across the borders. Like we are connected today, sitting in different places, but again, a lot of negative news sometimes spreads, and that also affects the mental health of people. For example, the recent war which is going on between Russia and Ukraine, a lot of people might be depressed from the news which is coming from that part of the world. And uh, during the COVID-19, there were a lot of things which were not at all positive. But I think it was just about how you interpret that news and what side of it you look at, isn't it, Mark?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, it's so true what you say. I mean, social media, as with, I think, almost anything in life, there's a positive and a negative, isn't there? I mean, and people really like to, criticize social media, but, a lot of people connect globally on social media, and it can really be a force for good. But equally, I think, if you're using social media and, you're looking at very negative images and, and goodness me, I mean, the world is full of them, isn't it? Really, climate change, war. I mean, then I think it can have a really detrimental effect on mental health. And I just think it's important to be conscious and, of the data that you're taking in, just to be mindful of the data you're taking in, and just to, really, really be careful that it is balanced. You're utilizing all of the wonderful benefits of social media, but you're trying to mitigate against some of the more negative aspects. What do you think, Joe?
Yeah, I agree. Something like, it's not news related, but like as we were sort of discussing on the forest therapy episode the other day, how even just looking at images of stuff like forests or woods, it can have a positive effect. It's the same thing. You see something negative like war, as you said before, with the war. that it'll have a negative effect on your emotions, even if it's not physically affecting you, it will mentally affect you because you're feeling sorry for the people that it's happening to.
And again, I just think you just got to be, I mean, I think this is true of all of us, you know. I mean, I think we just got to be mindful of the information we're taking in, because, I think we all have, you know, as humans, a great capacity for empathy. But if we're just sitting in front of screens watching, you know, death, destruction, climate change, you know, day in, day out, then, you know, we're going to be very affected. And it's right that we are affected. But I think in terms of our mental health, we've just got to be conscious around what we're taking in, really.
Yeah. What do you think, Joe, can be some of the ways? I think I've already asked you specifically, but to come out of this stress, are there any resources that you find which are available on the internet or in the open space, which people can really access to? Because when we really search for these kind of resources, it's quite limited in number, and it always comes down to taking help from your friends or taking help from your direct family members. So are there any specific resources that people can look at?
Well, we actually, funny enough, we did an episode on social media and mental health, and I was actually re-listening to it the other day. And one of our guests, she's a professional in mental health, but she's also had personal experience, and she just went on a social media cleanse. So even just taking yourself away from social media, maybe delete the apps off your phone for a few days, and take a break from social media, go out and enjoy the world, because there are positive things outside the door. Or obviously everything that's happening on the news or everything that's happening in today's life or what everyone's doing, you're seeing right in front of you on the screen. You're going to just sit there and scroll, and it's just going to have a negative impact on your brain. But like also like stuff I use, there's stuff like Beyond Blue. You can look at if you're in Australia. There's stuff in the UK you can use, like Samaritans that we also have over here. There's so many resources. We share all the links and stuff. Whenever we show our podcast, we share all the links that people can use, like suicide helplines and stuff like that. There are resources out there, and I think they feel like there's a lot more that's been put in place. Like a lot of our guests we've spoken to, some of the stuff they've done, like the projects, and one of our guests goes and speaks to schools and stuff about mental health. I don't want to say what the word is because I know you're not supposed to say it nowadays, but he tried to end his own life by jumping off a building and ended up paralyzed. But he goes and shares his story with schools now because he survived that, and he goes and speaks to these schools about mental health, and it helps people because he always has people come up to him and say to him, "Oh, thank you so much. I feel more obliged to tell people my story or share what I'm going through." And then we've had other episodes where people got this lady, her husband ended his own life a few years ago, and she's done a book about their journey where they finished his bucket list off. And she does like packages and stuff for primary school children to learn about mental health, because I know there's a lack of resources in schools in terms of mental health. There definitely was when I was younger.
Yeah, and I think, and obviously, I mean, I'm duty bound to say, you can also see a professional psychotherapist. I mean, professionals are out there. Yeah, and I in terms of, again, a generalization, but in terms of millennials, I mean, thankfully, I think there is a change from my generation. There does seem to be a lot less stigma around going into therapy, and that is fantastic, because therapy is a place that, that people can really find, healing. So, I mean, professionals are out there, and, if you are feeling really, really bad, see a professional. I mean, therapy can be really, really helpful for people. I mean, it is just the energy, I think, to reach out. I think, and once the reaching out is done, and the relationship with, a therapist is in place, then, I think the therapy space can be really healing for people.
Sometimes I also feel from my university experience here in Australia that there are a lot of resources available, as Joe also pointed out. Sometimes students have to say that there are no resources available because they don't even know that there are resources available in the university itself. It means that there is lack of communication, probably on the part of the universities and also the governments, which should be communicating those resources that are available for the people. So how important do you feel, Mark, because you just raised this point, how important do you feel that communication of those resources which are already available to the people is important?
I mean, yeah, I mean, I'm going to give a short answer to this, because this is really, really kind of Joe's Joe talks a lot about this on the show, but yeah, I mean, there needs to be more information out there. Absolutely. I mean, the government has a duty, really, to break down the stigma around mental health. Mental health, physical health, arguably they're no different. But even if they're looked at as different domains, mental health should be treated the same as physical health. If you break your leg, then there's loads of information around what you do. But if you drop into a depressive phase, okay, there's not the same kind of accessible information. And I think governments have a duty just to normalize the fact that that humans often, I think it's true for all of us, we all have mental health to deal with in different ways, and there needs to be more out there in terms of resources, especially in schools. And if it's okay, I'm going to just let Joe talk, because this is quite a passion for you, Joe, isn't it, around schools?
Yeah. Well, actually, funny enough, I worked for Swinburne University, and we had an incident. I can't say exactly what it is. We had an incident a few weeks ago that was quite traumatic for staff and students, and they had a counsellor come in, and they offered it to staff and students to go and see this counsellor if you'd been affected by the event that had happened. So I went and saw it because it affected me and stuff. I suffer from anxiety, so it affected me more than it probably would a normal person. But I went and saw the counsellor, and that really helped. And like last few jobs I've been in, they've all had employee and assistant programs that's been put in place, which is a thing that I've noticed is probably a new thing. But as with schools, I was bullied a lot through school, and I talk about it a lot on the podcast. And the resources out there were just, I didn't know anything about mental health apart from depression and suicide, just because I've seen it on the news, and there was nothing, like we didn't get taught about it in school. We didn't get taught about it in like PSHE, which is like I can't remember what it stands for, but it's basically when you just learn about stuff like sex education and stuff like that. And they didn't tell us anything, and I feel like there needs to be more in schools, because at a young age you suffer from all these things like anxiety, depression, especially with exams, and if you don't know what it is, you don't know how to deal with it, and you just feel like you're different, and then you're more likely to like separate yourself from everything or seclude yourself from society, and it's more likely to lead to suicide because you're not going to talk to anyone. For me personally, it took me till I was probably about maybe 18 or something, or 20 something, for me to know that I had anxiety and depression, because I came back from a holiday and I was suffering from all these like dizzy spells and panic attacks, which I'd never had before. And I went to the doctor, and he said, yes, you've got anxiety and depression. And I had to tell my mum all this stuff, like I'd been self-harming and stuff because I had to break up with a girlfriend. And I had to get the doctor to tell my mum, because I just couldn't bring it to myself to admit it to my mum. Mum didn't know all this stuff. But the same goes for a lot of people. People are too scared to talk about it. And from fear of being either bullied or secluded from society, or if that's the right word, or like just like outcasts because of the way society is today. And that needs to change, and that's what we're trying to do on the podcast. And I'm hoping there's a lot more out there, like celebrities are talking about it, and these are people that people look up to, that maybe that's going to encourage people to speak up. And I'm hoping there's more resources put into schools as well, because there needs to be. And one of our guests is doing that with the primary school. She's hanging out all these books and stuff, and she speaks about she wrote the book, and she's done like a children's book for the things about suicide, which has been really good. Like, it's like child appropriate. I feel like there needs to be more stuff like that in schools.
Yeah, can I just add, and things like, I mean, I was reading about a mindfulness program, a school mindfulness program recently. I mean, I think that's fantastic. I mean, why are we not teaching children how to manage their mental health? I mean, goodness me, when I was at school, there were loads of lessons about, eat your 3 veg a day and do this and go for a walk, but there's nothing on mental health, and children, humans, struggle with mental health is something that needs to be managed, right? So we need to be teaching this in schools, and we also need to be normalizing the fact that sometimes people get depressed, sometimes people get anxious, just to, and even as a therapist, sometimes even just saying to someone, lots of people experience that. Well, it's like a light bulb moment for some younger people, because they think it's just them. So we really need to open up these conversations in schools and and do things like mindfulness programs, give people the tools to deal with anxiety, depression, different mental health conditions. Yeah, it's essential, especially in the world we live in. It becomes increasingly more important, I think, that the government looks at normalizing mental health and introducing kind of mental health programs into schools. It's really important.
Yeah, definitely. Like more than the knowledge, sometimes even I feel that the soft skills that you gain in the school, for example, how to present yourself in front of the world, how to cope up in stressful situations. If you're taught these things at that level, then basically it's preparing you for the future job market. Because if you look at any of the top leaders, be it Elon Musk or Mark Zuckerberg, they will never focus on sending their children to schools to gain knowledge, just knowledge, but also polish on your soft skills. How to communicate well in front of the people, how to present yourselves, and how to cope up in tough situations, how to be resilient. I know this has been a very famous term since the pandemic hit, because everybody was learning how to be resilient, how to cope up with new kind of working environments, because that itself was a bit stressful. So that's what lays the foundation of my next question as well, which is, how do different factors in the society really contribute to increasing your mental stress? When we start looking at our family, or we start looking at our relatives and thinking about what they might think of us if we don't open up, or if we open up in front of the society related to any part of our identity or the situation we are going through. So how much do you think it affects, starting with Joe, and then Mark can add to that?
Yeah, I think especially with generational as well, there's a lot of my friends that have these tough dads that are like manly men and stuff. It's all I hate that term. Being a man doesn't mean that you have to be strong and stuff, but just being like these manly men and well-built people that don't really discuss mental health, don't really talk about mental health with their children, and then if their children have problems with mental health, like some of my friends do, they're too scared to talk about it because they feel like they're being seen less as a man. For me, I was always lucky because my mum is a nurse and she always knew about mental health and stuff. So once I eventually told her and stuff, I had the really good support network, and my sister was already going through stuff. My dad didn't really understand it until I was really unwell for a few years ago, which I also mentioned like one of the podcast episodes. And my dad's so much more understanding. He really wants to learn about it. He always asks me questions about it, which is like massive for me because his generation probably didn't really talk about those sort of things. I'm sure he's had depressive days, but they've just been taught to deal with it and man up, which is a horrible phrase. As my friend Will said on one of the episodes that he came on, man up has been told to a lot of men, and women, obviously women are allowed to show emotion a lot more than men, but at the same time, there's still that, I think it's more so in men, but this obviously can happen with women as well. Women sometimes don't want to put that pressure on other people, especially with pregnancy. Like they're suffering when after pregnancy with postnatal depression, they don't want to talk about it because they're too scared that people might think that they don't want to have a child, or they feel like the child's a burden when they're not. It's their mental state. Yeah, I'll let Mark discuss. Like, what would you like to add?
I mean, I guess shame. I guess shame is at the bottom of it. And there's so much social construction around how we're meant to be, isn't it? I mean, men, women. I mean, goodness me, society from the minute we're born, we're conditioned. You feel male. Well, I mean, in terms of everything, gender identity, sexual identity. I mean, it's across the board, isn't it? What we're meant to aspire to. And that's a tough gig for people, isn't it? Because I mean, I think when people feel different, then I think a lot of shame comes in, and I think that shame is socially constructed, and I think it stops people from reaching out. It stops people from from doing the things that are going to make themselves feel better. It stops people from seeing professionals, and and there are so many pressures, I think, on young people now. I mean, I would say there are a lot more pressures really on millennials than perhaps when I was growing up. I mean, the pressure's everywhere, isn't it? I mean, the climate crisis, young people having to deal with that on a day-to-day basis, images of the earth breaking down, politics, work, there's so much more competition, I think, for jobs now with millennials. It's so difficult, to get really, really kind of nourishing, meaningful work, earning a living. So, yeah, I think I don't know if I've answered your question. I'm segueing a bit, but I just think there's a lot of pressure on young people now. Really, really.
Stuff like reality TV as well.
Yeah.
Stuff like reality TV builds up a heightened sense of body image that you have to aspire to be like that. And if you don't look like that, that you're not how you should look. There should be more body positive things. There should have more normal people on those sort of shows. I get that they're trying to get people to watch, but if you had a normal person on those shows, as Drew said in the podcast episode, you had a normal person, maybe a guy with a dad bod guy on those shows, it would be more realistic. They call it reality TV, but it's not realistic. Not everyone looks like that.
Yeah.
And that causes a lot of depression for people.
Yeah, absolutely. What do you think in terms of, I've already asked you related to the government, what actions can the government take? But do you think the other kind of stakeholders, such as community volunteers coming up from different communities, local volunteers, or probably, even counselors at city levels, they can start doing some small initiatives in their own councils or in their own cities, which not only motivates them, because I see a lot of great steps also where the government people, they are involved in setting up their own social media initiatives to reduce mental stress. So have you seen any such initiatives in your councils which you want to share, or have you shared such things in your podcast before?
Mark, did you want to talk about mental health first aiders?
Yeah, mental health first aid. Yeah, there's a mental. Well, it's such a large subject, but just to kind of talk about it briefly. Yeah, where I live, there's a hospital, and they want to train. I think it's like 40% of their staff to be mental health first aiders. So if anybody is struggling with mental health, then they wear kind of badges, so they know there's somebody there, immediately accessible that they can talk to. And the global mental health first aid organization, they want, I think it's like 40% of the world to be trained as mental health first aiders. So there's always somebody to talk to. As a mission statement, I think that is absolutely fantastic. So I think that's certainly one initiative I can talk about. Yeah, mindfulness programs.
Funny enough, they started here as well.
Yeah,
but funny enough, it started over here as well. As our guest Hannah, we did an episode. I think it might have been one of the first episodes of this season 2. Hannah Buckland came on, who's one of the leaders of the mental health first aid. And she came on and she said that it started in Australia and they're training more people to come and do it. But like also here, like I feel there's more stuff going into schools now. Sorry, the printer's going off. It's the problem of being in an office.
So I think that's what I was trying to discuss from before as well, related to the fact that this should become a part of your childhood education, as Mark was pointing out. And I think before we end this podcast, we should definitely discuss on more ways on how we can make it a part of someone's childhood, not only through schools, but also taking it to their homes, where the parents can also start discussing about some of the things with their children and trying to be more open with them, trying to ask those questions, isn't it?
Yeah, I think for me, I think it's all about the education, and I think and I think as the younger generations, start having family, Gen X, millennials, hopefully, but because I think younger generations are much more open about mental health and have so much more understanding, and so more mindful that when they have children, I think these conversations are more likely to happen. A lot of millennials have been in therapy. A lot of millennials have accessed mental health services, for support. So hopefully, generationally, then these conversations will become more normalised. Really, that's my hope, anyway. What do you think?
Me
Joe?
too.
Yeah.
I agree. I feel like because this generation has gone through so much and knows more about mental health than probably the previous generation, that it'll reflect on our children. Like we'll notice signs more than our parents probably would. Like now, I reckon, because there's more out there in the world about mental health.
And also, I think in terms of, you know, the social construction, I think the social construction is breaking down. You know, I mean, certainly there's a long way to go. You know, the social construction in terms of things like gender identity, sexual identity, it's breaking down, isn't it? So I think people are hopefully going to be left in a position where it's okay to be you. Whereas I think in previous generations, you know, you had to fit into these rigid ideas around so many different aspects, you know, but one of them, what's it like to be a man? What's it like to be a woman? I think as these things are starting to dissolve in the younger generations, then I think hopefully, you know, it's going to be easier to be you, really.
Yep. And before we end today's episode, I would definitely want to ask both of you the top 2 or 3 tips on mental health that people can take away today, because we have discussed about a lot of things, right? From the schools to the millennials to the people who are working. But any 2 or 3 things that you think that people can take away from this particular episode, starting from you, Mark, and then passing on to Joe?
Yeah, I mean, again, I would say, you know, try and reach out, you know, try and talk to other people. I mean, again, I would say, you know, mindfulness, you know, putting things in that you do every day in order to support your mental health, I think is incredibly important. Positive psychology, there's a whole kind of branch of psychology where there's research into, you know, what makes people happy. I mean, I would encourage the listeners, you know, to look at positive psychology and just find some techniques that they can do every day. Exercise is another one. Regular exercise is, you know, the best thing for mental health. So I would encourage people to exercise and being in nature. I mean, there's a stack of research coming out of, you know, Japan kind of and South Korea about being in nature and, you know, the benefits to mental health. So they would be 3 that I would say.
I think mine, one, look after yourself. Always put yourself before others. Like, it's so key to stay on top of your mental health. Like, in terms of mental health, always put yourself first, because then you can look after other people if you look after yourself first. And then my second one is, don't be afraid to speak to someone. There'll always be someone to listen, or there'll be someone go through the same thing as you. And third one, one thing if you're helping someone with mental health and you've been through something similar, don't try and tell them to kind of do the same thing as you, because obviously it's not one size fits all. Everything different. There's something that works for everyone else. Like, there's always something that works differently for different people. It was just something I saw on Instagram. Like, if you're helping people, don't try and like say, "Oh, I did this, you should do that." Maybe just sit and listen to them, see what they want to do about it. Yeah, that's all. That's my one.
And can I just add one more before we finish? You know, it's shameful self-publishing, but publicizing, but also, you know, hashtag never alone. You know, there's always someone you can talk to.
Yeah, check out the podcast.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's my other one. Check out the podcast as well.
Absolutely, and that's what I was about to end with. So if you want to check their podcast, which I will also put on my LinkedIn, go checking out their podcast on Never Alone. And if you have some links to share, Joe, you can share with me, and I'm going to forward it to my network as well. And thank you so much to both of you for taking out your precious time today. I really appreciate that, because I know very few people want to talk about mental health. It's a very, very delicate topic, but you came, and not only came, but you're also running your own podcast and you're talking about mental health every day. So I think kudos to both of you for doing this, because you don't even know how many lives you are saving on a day-to-day basis for people who are just listening to you and feeling a bit relaxed, feeling less stressed, and maybe getting some good tips from you both. So thank you so much for sharing those tips. And I'm sure you also enjoyed this discussion as much as I did.
Yeah.
This is an Ultimate Global Podcast. Hello, and welcome to our special weekly podcast on trending international and social affairs. You're listening to Saurabh Kaura and George Mavros from Sydney.